So the last video that I made was over a year ago. The most recent movie I've covered on this channel is Solo, a Star Wars story. Thought it would be a pretty fun idea if I just made a video that condenses all the thoughts I have on the movies I saw this year. Now, most of these films I have already reviewed on various social media platforms, and those reviews are probably going to be more in-depth. Because I've seen so many movies this year and I want this video to come out relatively quickly, I'm going to have to make sure that I keep the reviews slightly brief. Also keep in mind that these are only the films I have seen as I record this. This is just everything that I've seen in between the beginning of the year and now.
I will also be talking about these movies in the order I saw them, not the order they came out.
Anyway, let's get started. The very first movie I saw this year was How to Train Your Dragon 3, or How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World, and it was really disappointing. Now, I'm of the opinion that the first two How to Train Your Dragon movies are fantastic, but with this new one, you can really tell the writers had no idea where to take the story after the second one. I don't know how much of this movie's plot is based on the book, but to be honest, the vast majority of it just feels like filler. The main plotline is very thin and only brought about by characters constantly making decisions they have no reason to be making. One of the biggest disappointments for me was the film's subtitle. For a movie about the hidden world, there's maybe 5 minutes of it in the entire thing. The various subplots and running jokes range from either inoffensive to just flat out stupid. The film's villain is only remotely entertaining or threatening in the very first scene he's in. The longer he's on screen, the more his presentation just becomes really toothless. Even the action scenes are incredibly autopiloted and uninteresting, which, if you've seen the second movie, you'd know is a total crime. I guess the movie wasn't exactly terrible. There was some okay stuff about it. It has a solid foundation of two of the decade's best animated movies. The music is still pretty good, some of the characters retain their likability, there's a few aesthetic changes I like, the ending ties up most of the franchise's loose ends, but everything else just feels super rushed. Watch it if you really have to see how the trilogy ends, but I don't really recommend it otherwise, and I will give this one a 5 out of 10 salt shakers. Next up was Jordan Peele's Us, and it was pretty enjoyable. Get Out was one of my favorite movies of 2017 and something that really raised the bar for modern horror, but I kind of wonder if Peele would have benefited from it being something his career led up to. Us has a few traces of Get Out's depth, but it's definitely more of a straightforward genre film. I'm wondering if people would be reading as deeply into this movie as they are if it wasn't from the same writer-director. This is only his second feature film, so I can't really speculate too much on that, but audiences are extremely fickle when you don't live up to the standard they've set up for you in their heads. On its own, Us is still a pretty great horror slasher flick anyway, so it's not that big a problem. Peele has an obvious eye for detail evident in his direction. He's a person who takes opportunities for clever touches of period detail and screenplay reincorporation that wouldn't cross a lot of other people's minds. Each of the main characters' doppelgangers represents something about their character, but these connections are never spelled out or spoon-fed to you. Even something like the Tethered's uniform is designed so thoughtfully. They're probably the closest we've gotten to a modern slasher icon like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees in a long time. Lupita Nyong'o is fantastic in both of her roles. An often overlooked aspect of this movie is the number of seamless dual performances, and I mean this both in the way the special effects help pull it off and the way the actors perform them. Something I love about Jordan Peele's style of horror specifically is his tendency for the characters to use improvised household weapons. The film is incredibly funny, it has a breakneck pace, it's consistently tense, and I loved that remix of I Got 5 on It just as much as I did when it was in the trailer. I enjoyed Us thoroughly, and chances are you will too, and I'm giving it a 7 out of 10 salt shakers. If I'm being honest, I only saw Aladdin because I wanted to talk about how bad it was with a hint of legitimacy. I have a very negative disposition towards these live-action Disney remakes, but much to my surprise, I was really entertained by this one. At least, relatively. I realize that's not a popular opinion to have right now, so hear me out. This is the first of these Disney remakes where I feel like the director's style came the closest to shining through the obvious studio mandates. Like, Guy Ritchie knew that if he refused the job, they'd just give the movie to someone who wouldn't try as hard, so he took the job to keep the film from just being a complete disaster. There's a pervasive sense of fun that makes it really easy to tell what Ritchie had control over and what he was forced to do. The actors playing Aladdin and Jasmine had enough romantic chemistry to keep me invested in their characters. The action is competent enough. Will Smith is sporadically interesting, and even though the production design is mostly CG, I gotta admit there is a certain creativity to it. In a more perfect world, this would have been an Arabic version of Black Panther, but there's only so much you can hope for. That's the good stuff. Now, the movie does the best job it can with the things it has to translate from cartoon to live action, but Abu, Iago, Raja, all the animals are now just complete non-characters. The CG redesigns they're all given eliminate any shred of personality they had in the animated original. I also don't know who decided Jafar should suck now, but whatever. Jasmine's new song is terrible and feels really out of place. The style of music they're going for in this one musical number doesn't mesh at all with the style of Disney music from the 90s. I am very ready to admit my enjoyment of this film is entirely shallow, but if these are going to be some of the most profitable movies at the box office anyway, might as well make them good for something, even if it's shallow. If your movie's responsible for me finding out who Naomi Scott is, I mean, how mad can I really get? Whatever, fuck it, 6 out of 10. Actually, it probably deserves more like a 5, who cares? The next movie I saw was Pokemon Detective Pikachu. Don't know why a series with such a wealth of video games ended up with an adaptation of this specific one, but anyway, this movie is terrible. It's pretty easy to figure out that this film's main charm is seeing the various Pokemon now in live action, and that novelty is certainly there. Gotta admit, it was pretty neat to see my boy Bulbasaur. As a fan, I even appreciated them incorporating references to creatures and characters from all the generations instead of just falling back too hard on the first generation, since it's the one that's the most popular. But they missed out on a very important part of the franchise: the battling. There was only really one, and it didn't last that long. Why leave that incredibly important element to the franchise out of your movie? Maybe some more action would have given this film a broader appeal. I've never seen a movie so effortlessly mess up a huge marketing opportunity like that. The novelty of CG Pokemon was all the movie really had to offer. The acting from pretty much everybody was downright terrible, especially from the tacked-on love interest. Ryan Reynolds' voice performance was okay, I guess. The lighting was surprisingly awful. Pokemon has a really wide age appeal, so I don't think the "it's a kids movie" excuse applies here either. I'm 22 and not even close to the oldest fan of the property I know, so a plot this flavorless, predictable, and bland told with such low-effort presentation isn't really covered by that cop-out soundbite of an argument that doesn't hold up regardless of context anyways, let alone in a PG-13 film. This movie is bad and offers nothing but some lovingly rendered CG creatures you may or may not recognize from your childhood, and I'm giving this a 3 out of 10. Godzilla King of the Monsters is next, and the best way to describe it is uneven. This is a movie with a pretty harsh audience and critic divide, but strangely enough, both sides of that argument have some semblance of a point for once. The impression audiences have of the critical consensus is that there needed to be more emphasis on the human characters, which they see as stupid, seeing as this is a kaiju genre film, and the action is all that matters. Now that's partly true, and the action is pretty good. I much prefer the first American Godzilla reboot from 2014, but even I could admit there's not as much straight-up carnage in that one, but what there was more purpose and depth in the story. What the audiences get wrong is critics all being morons. Like, they know Godzilla movies' main draw is monsters hitting each other with giant beams of energy. Having seen the film, it's not the quantity of drama that's the problem, because there's plenty of it, but that it's all terrible. We're strung along with several human characters who all stink, which is a big problem when that takes up 2/3 of your movie. Critics aren't upset there's not more drama, they're upset the writer did such a bad job. And that sums up the movie really. If you want kaiju fighting, you'll get what you paid for, just don't ask to be invested in any of it. Most of the plot is forced and contrived, and there is not a single satisfying or compelling moment in this film that doesn't involve a kaiju. And I'm giving this a 5 out of 10. I also saw Rocketman, and it was pretty good. It was about as much the spiritual successor to Bohemian Rhapsody as you may have expected. It was better in pretty much every way, though. I especially appreciated how Elton John was presented as a man who had genuinely wrecked his body with drugs, and while I expected more, showed that he engaged in various societal taboos. He's not a cartoon version of himself, and instead more realistic. The film is still presented as a fantasy musical, but at no point did these sequences feel out of place or in conflict with the film's tone. If you consider how fantastical and boisterous Elton John's music and persona is, the heightened reality makes a lot of sense. Taron Egerton does a great job in the lead role and is the definite standout of the film. It's clear that not only does he have the ability to perform Elton's music and life story, but genuinely respects those things as well. The kid actor who played young Elton was kind of annoying, but even he wasn't anything too bad. I guess if I had to say something bad about it, the movie doesn't stray very far from a traditional biopic screenplay. You see the ups and downs of their success, and the subject's larger-than-life becomes humanized. Nothing really wrong with that, but it's pretty clear the story was massaged into its cinematic structure. The more creative aspects of the film come forth in the acting, the cinematography, the musical sequences, than the writing itself. Not much else to say, but Rocketman is a good biopic for a well-respected musician brought to life by a fantastic performance. It also made for a good Pride Month movie, so keep that in mind if you were looking for one. And I'm giving it a 7 out of 10. I saw John Wick 3 Parabellum the very last day it was in theaters in my town, and I am so glad I did because this movie is fantastic. You need to have seen the other two to understand what's going on, but both of those are really good too, so how big of a problem is that really? This franchise is a modern movie-making miracle. They shouldn't exist. They can't. They take every other action movie and just kick their teeth in. This movie makes Captain America the Winter Soldier look like Baby's Day Out. Movies with action this good should only be made when you give George Miller 30 years to perfect his Ultra Instinct powers. It picks right up where Chapter 2 left off and proceeds to give us action scenes at a rapid pace that outdo themselves again and again, each with a new gimmick milked of potential without overstaying their welcome. Keanu Reeves anchors these movies by giving John Wick such appeal as a character. They really wouldn't be the same without him. When the first one came out, dude was in production of f***ing Knock Knock, and now he's one of the most adored actors working today. Wick never talks too much, but Reeves delivers every word as a character with grit and history. His performance is incredibly physical as well. He's the top assassin or whatever, but he's not invincible. He has to constantly be on top of his game in order to beat these guys. You genuinely believe this guy has gone through hell just to survive. Some parts of the world building still don't make a lot of sense, but only a few of them really interfere with the plot. There's a man built up to be super important to the lore of this assassin organization, but he just felt tacked on as a plot device to revoke the bounty put on John. And the last 5 minutes of the film really pushed the boundaries of remote plausibility these movies have done a surprising job at upholding. It was a really unnecessary part of the film and made me leave the theater with some mixed thoughts. But despite that, John Wick 3 is still another amazing entry in this franchise. In terms of raw fight choreography, I don't know how many American movies compare to this. Period. I don't know how much higher it would be without that lapse in plausibility in the last 5 minutes, but I'm still giving it an 8 out of 10. Toy Story 4 is the least necessary sequel to ever exist. How do I review this? It's hard to even treat it like I'm reviewing a film, because no matter how hard I try, I just can't forget that they made another one when they absolutely didn't need to. It wasn't as self-indulgent as the third movie, but you can tell the writers had no idea how to follow it up. None of the characters have anything to do. If you're not Woody, Bo Peep, or Buzz, you have no impact on the story. And that's being incredibly generous to Buzz. The new characters, Key and Peele, Keanu Reeves, Christina Hendricks, Tony Hale, they're okay, I guess? I thought Forky would be much more involved with the plot than he ended up being. In actuality, he was just a borderline MacGuffin. I wasn't moved by anything that was supposed to be emotional or funny. In both those ways, I think it's the weakest of the four. Just as I anticipated, it added nothing to the franchise. Now this is gonna sound like a joke, but I promise you it isn't. My biggest problem with this film is a literal big problem. Toy Story 4 shows us the return of Bo Peep since she wasn't in Toy Story 3, except for some reason one of the character designers decided it was necessary to make her distractingly thick. And not in a way that felt natural, like she was originally designed to look that way, but rather because they wanted you to notice it. They made her a character with a bit more plot agency, which is nice, but instead of being invested in her character, every scene she was in, I was asking myself why they made her butt so big. It was really distracting. Stop it, Disney. Stop designing your characters this way. Why at any point did you consider the sexual energy of a character who is a toy? That is weird. Let that be a lesson to you, Pixar. If you keep making these unnecessary sequels, the closest I'll come to an emotional reaction is uncomfortably wondering why you want me to fuck the characters. 5 out of 10. A complete creative flatline. SpiderMan Into the Dishonest Marketing was the most disappointing Marvel movie in a long time. I really enjoyed Tom Holland's portrayal of Spider-Man. I feel like he's the best interpretation besides maybe Miles Morales in Into the Spider-Verse, and I was excited to see him again. But there's just nothing about Far From Home that wasn't better in Homecoming. The teenage romance and banter was pretty good, Ned is a likable sidekick, Zendaya's MJ is probably the one thing that is better in this movie than the last. She's way more likable and not just a wet blanket with 7 minutes of screen time. I did initially like the casting of Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio, but performance-wise he won me over just fine. And I liked seeing Peter react to the suddenly changing expectations thrust upon him by Nick Fury and S.H.I.E.L.D. One minute he's told to stick to his own neighborhood, the next he's fighting Thanos and enlisted to fight giant elemental monsters. It's a very palatable and frustrating situation. But besides those few things, I dislike pretty much everything else. The narrative thrusts in this stop and start way too suddenly, the amount of downtime between each story beat is ridiculous. The comedy is for the most part terrible, there's a noticeable overburden to pick up the pieces after Avengers Endgame, and as far as this film is concerned, the marketing hinting at a multiverse was a boldly told lie. No spoilers, but what they end up doing with Mysterio's character is the worst handling of an MCU villain since Guy Pearce in Iron Man 3. Everything they do with him is just a complete downgrade, including his action scenes, his motivation, and his evil plan might just make the least amount of sense out of every villain plan in the franchise. By the end, he's just not a fun character to be around. If this is any indication of post-Endgame era Marvel, then I'm not looking forward to any of it. When Martin Scorsese talks about these movies being theme park rides, this is the kind of film he's talking about, and I am giving it a 4 out of 10. Good post-credit scenes, though. I saw Captain Marvel on a cruise, and
let's go, girls.
On this cruise, I also saw the remake of Dumbo, and it was terrible. Now, I've never seen the animated original, so I have no real attachment to it, but on its own, this is still a terrible film. The acting is the most notable detriment to everything else. Ava Green has a ridiculously fake-sounding accent, Colin Farrell is somehow more stilted here than he was in The Lobster, where he was specifically directed to be emotionless. Michael Keaton looks like he's about to bust a blood vessel in his brain and die in every scene. Since this was directed by Tim Burton, I'm assuming his role was supposed to be played by Johnny Depp, but he just directed him the same. Farrell's children, but especially his son, are not only borderline useless to the plot, they are among the worst child performances I've ever seen. I kid you not, there was a scene where the daughter was supposed to run away crying, but you can clearly see her facial expression is the same wide-eyed horizontal frown she's had for the entire film. Everyone else is just a poorly acted prop character. The only one who seemed to be trying was Danny DeVito, and despite everything against the film, he's the only guy who felt like he cared about what was going on. The rest of the film is just painfully forced. They try way too hard to make Dumbo so cute in this. It's disgusting. He's almost a non-character in this when I feel the original was at least somewhat more about his experiences. Instead, we're given the most bog standard of stories and messages about heart over wealth. Tim Burton usually can give a film's look some personality, but the whole film looks so washed out and fake. The romance between Farrell and Green I couldn't even tell was happening, the acting from both parties was so awful. The effects aren't even up to par. A flying elephant is one of those things that really doesn't translate well from cartoon to live action. There wasn't a single scene where I didn't feel completely embarrassed for everyone involved. Besides DeVito's performance, everything was either forced down your throat or a complete flatline. Pass over this one even if you like these Disney remakes, and I'm giving it a 2 out of 10. The final movie I saw on this cruise was Isn't It Romantic, and it was okay. I had no interest in seeing this film outside of this context, but I was intrigued by the premise of the film alone. Rebel Wilson goes into a coma or something and wakes up inside the unrealistically idyllic world of a stereotypical romantic comedy movie, a genre her character has a particular distaste for. Now, as someone who dislikes most romantic comedies, specifically for the tropes mocked by this movie, I was interested in what direction they were going to go with it. The biggest disappointment, I suppose, is the adherence to genre formula from a plot perspective. It doesn't really break new ground, but the parts of the film where Rebel Wilson is actively mocking the fantasy world was still pretty enjoyable. She's not just pointing at what happens and says, oh, there's that cliche, she's actively reacting to them. There's even a genuinely clever sequence in a karaoke bar where, despite not knowing how to sing, she performs anyway, knowing the world will generate a perfectly synchronized and auto-tuned musical number around her. It was a funny bit. This is also Rebel Wilson's best performance. Her annoyance at the overly flowery world around her is both hilarious and understandable. Towards the end, as the plot becomes more standard, the film gets less interesting. And when she wakes up from the coma, there's some really cheesy moments, but overall I remember the moments I enjoyed and laughed at than the moments that made me groan. If the film not being a complete subversion of the genre sounds hypocritical to you and will ruin your enjoyment of it, that's understandable, but it didn't erode my enjoyment of the film, and I recommend checking it out if you're curious. And I give Isn't It Romantic a 6 out of 10. Next up is Ari Aster's Midsommar, and it was awesomer. Word of mouth very quickly spread the idea that this is an incredibly weird film, and the masses are correct. I love movies that are like that, especially if they have a darkly comic or horrific edge to them. It's actually the only reason I saw this, and I was rewarded greatly for my curiosity. Now, much like Hereditary, Midsommar is not a film for the faint of heart. This film's gore and sexual content are explicit in ways that usually fall outside general audiences' comfort zones, even for people who might enjoy those things in more standard contexts. The characters are set up with extreme diligence, but Aster's best work is done when he pits those characters' mental states against the oppressive hyperspace inherent to the film's setting. He makes fantastic use of depth of field by showing action or points of attention occurring in the background, or distorting points of the frame with special effects to stimulate the altered mental state of a character. These details, usually reserved for the negative space of the frame, encourage audience engagement to seek and discover little things for themselves. It is because of this I can't praise Florence Pugh's brilliant performance enough. I know everyone adores Toni Collette in Hereditary, but Pugh is just as Oscar-worthy as she was and will probably end up just as snubbed too. Most actresses could not portray the amount of grief she goes through with such believability, but with so many special effects added in post to simulate her specific mental state, she had to demonstrate incredible trust in Aster's direction as well as actualize what he needed her to do. I already expect good things from Jack Reynor and Will Poulter, but the whole supporting cast does a splendid job. The film also develops a realistic, uncomfortable, toxic relationship. The film is largely metaphorical about love and connection to other people, with numerous clever moments and lines of dialogue. Although I think it's unwise to take everything that happens to the characters 100% literally, the strange way this film concludes will probably cause a lot of differing opinions. I would imagine, especially between couples in a similar situation. The film does such a good job creating a crescendo of madness, but it was a little difficult for the resolution to live up to my expectations. If you're paying any kind of attention, the broad strokes of the story really aren't that hard to predict, but I see Midsommar as a film that is more about the execution and the experience you have watching it, rather than the conceptual elements of the story. The euphoric madness the film eventually settles into is a rare and sublime cinematic experience. By the end, I was enthralled, grinning ear to ear at the delightful, welcoming insanity before me. I cannot recommend Midsommar enough, and I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. It was a 10, but I think it might have been a 9, and usually when you have to think about it, it's a 9 instead of a 10, so I think it's a 9. Next is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and it was fantastic. This is a very different kind of story from Quentin Tarantino. While I don't agree that this doesn't feel like a Tarantino movie, I concede there's a very different sense of what the movie wants to accomplish. Instead of wanting you to be on the edge of your seat the whole time, this is a film that invites you to sink so far back into it and just enjoy the world it creates for a few hours. And the best part is that it works. It works completely. There is so much loving detail put into every aspect of the production design and setting, with the film going to great lengths to show it off and engross you in its scale. Now, I've seen the film 3 times in theaters at this point, and every time it was over, I was sad this was all the time I get to spend with these characters. These are career best performances from both Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt. Rick Dalton has a surprising amount of pathos behind him, which is surprising for Tarantino. He doesn't usually opt to make you like his characters through straightforward empathy. Him and Cliff Booth are easily top-tier Tarantino characters. Despite her lack of dialogue almost becoming a point of controversy, Margot Robbie also gives her best performance as Sharon Tate. This is one of the most lively and gleeful performances I've seen from an actress in quite some time, made all the more impressive by her relative lack of dialogue. As is usual for Tarantino, there are tons of great character moments, regardless of the size of the role. The film is incredibly well edited. For such a sprawling narrative, the transitions between the many unfolding stories are immaculately well timed. The way the story is told, this is the breeziest 3-hour film you're likely to ever encounter. The dialogue, as one might expect, is great. It's not quite as flashy, but it's still rife with personality. The use of music and soundtrack is on par with Pulp Fiction, and it might honestly be even better. Tarantino doesn't indulge in revisionist history much until the very end of the film, but the way he incorporates the Manson family plays into a much larger meta-narrative about a sick desire for control. For a film that's more easygoing and affectionate than the director's other work, there are hints of criticism against old-school Hollywood's big swinging dick attitude towards getting away with everything, but namely abusing women. I'm not sure how intentional all this is, but there's too many subtle clues and story elements related to it that I can't dismiss it all as coincidence. This is the kind of film that gets better the more I think about it. The lack of gimmicks that people seem to like in Tarantino's previous 3 films is honestly a breath of fresh air. I highly recommend Once Upon a Time in Hollywood as one of the best films of the year, and I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. The Lion King remake is pure AIDS. I wrote an extended review on my blog that I'll link below, so read that for more details. It says everything I could hear and more, but to sum it up, its pretentious attempts at realism do nothing but hurt the film. Despite a talented cast, there are no good performances. It does the worst possible job of translating a film from animation to live action. Literally, every scene was embarrassingly worse than the original. I hated it. If you want to show kids their own version of The Lion King, just show them The Lion King. I give it a 1 out of 10. AIDS. Next is The Fast and Furious presents Hobbs and Shaw. This movie is utter trash. Until now, I've enjoyed each of the modernized sequels in this franchise. Of course, they're ridiculous, but not to a degree that is unenjoyable. This film, however, isn't even good turn off your brain and enjoy entertainment. It's just plain bad. I've historically enjoyed Dwayne Johnson in movies for the wink to the camera monolith he is, but I think this is the turning point where what used to be charisma is just obnoxious now. The way the characters are constantly reaffirming how cool they are to each other is just kind of gross. Like, I get The Rock is tough. I don't need endless monologues about how big his muscles are. I don't need endless monologues about how big his dick is. I'll still think he's cool without a contract dictating how many times he's allowed to get hit lest we think he isn't the god of machismo. Neither Hobbs nor Shaw have much character beyond hating each other, and it gets really old quickly when every scene is like that. Even the action isn't that great. I guess it's decent, but there's so much better stuff out there nowadays, including every Fast and Furious movie since the 5th. It's not shot all that great, and there's never any tension because the actors' contracts forbade them from losing. Kevin Hart and Ryan Reynolds are in this film, and they're both painfully unfunny. I think that's how you know if your franchise has jumped the shark. If you decide it's a good idea to pull in Ryan Reynolds and Kevin Hart just to play themselves. The entire existence of Idris Elba's character is just really dumb. The story was never the point of these movies, and somehow the plot manages to seem idiotic even by such a low standard. And it's all topped off with a terrible romance and some really bad foreshadowing. I guess I can't say nobody worked hard. Whoever is responsible for Vanessa Kirby's makeup and skincare routine obviously loves their job. You did a good job and deserve the biggest paycheck in the entire crew, so I give Hobbs & Shaw a 3 out of 10. Next up is It Chapter 2, and it's not much better. The first It movie was a fresh, entertaining surprise that added a blockbuster gravitas to a horror movie. Genuinely entertaining and well acted, it made me excited to see this, but I was let down almost entirely. This movie is almost 3 hours long, and it absolutely does not need to be. The second half of the story is only 10 minutes shorter than the 90s miniseries, and that includes both chapters. How do you screw up the pace of your movie that bad? I cannot fathom the reason why this film is structured as it is. Almost a third of the film is the exact same repeating scene structure. A character goes somewhere, suddenly Pennywise or some awful looking CG creature does a jump scare, and there was so many little nonsensical things and subplots that could have been elaborated on if you just took a little bit of time you used showing the same scene again and again and developed the story instead. Great job, you made your film feel bloated and choppy at the same time. The movie kind of falls apart during the climax, and they continually break the film's own rules and have characters make poor decisions. The way they eventually defeat Pennywise is embarrassing, and if we're being honest, the exact same thing they did in the first movie. The sole redeeming factor of this movie is its cast. Bill Skarsgård is good as Pennywise again, but the adult versions of each child are not only fantastic choices, but ones I wouldn't have expected. The Old Spice guy is Mike. Come on, that not only works, but it's so random you can't not appreciate the commitment to their choice. It's a real shame none of the actual film lives up to what the cast deserves. This is an infinitely frustrating horror film with not a single decent scare. Don't watch it even if you want to know what happens, and I give it a 3 out of 10. Something. Society. It's Joker, and it was okay. The most noteworthy aspect of this film is Joaquin Phoenix's performance, and much to the film's credit, he's as good as you've probably heard. In the hands of another director, I'm afraid this character would have come across like Jamie Foxx's Electro, but Phoenix helps bring out the tragedy of the character while still keeping him scary. And even though there's a whole lot of him in the movie, he continues to impress and keep the character interesting. But bear with me here. Take him out of the movie, and what exactly do you have left? A shallow character study that barely studies the character it's supposed to be about. To start with, I find this kind of story really discordant with what makes the Joker character interesting. The mystery that usually surrounds him, like in The Dark Knight, I find not only scarier, but contrasts well with Batman, whose backstory we usually go over in detail. It kind of feels like this movie is only about the Joker for name recognition, despite there being tons of other Batman villains better suited for this kind of story. Make a Mr. Freeze movie like this, and maybe we're onto something. But as it stands, while not without its moments, this movie is not deep. It's not nuanced. It is not clever. Every detail about Arthur's mental state and how awful Gotham is to live in is so on the nose and unsubtle. Like there was that scene where he takes his shirt off and pours kombucha on his head. I mean, what was that? The movie itself, and especially its fans, project such a lofty intellectual grasp onto the film's social commentary that it never really lives up to. It's clear the Joker was inspired by films like Taxi Driver and Falling Down, but it only takes the surface level charms in how those films address societal issues. Those movies have unspoken elements to them. With very limited examples, Joker does not do that. I wouldn't mind at all, except this film is treated like some kind of irreproachable holy grail of cinema, and it just doesn't warrant it with this script. It's not like I hated it or anything, it just doesn't match the description other people are giving it. I had a similar reaction to Joker as I did Captain Marvel. The film is not in the slightest worth all the controversy that has surrounded it. I bring this up to say that whatever side of the argument you're on, the film will probably match whatever description you have of it in your head. Joaquin solely makes the film worth it and elevates the material even if it's ultimately got nothing interesting to say. And I'm giving this a 6 out of 10. Then I saw The Lighthouse by Robert Eggers. This is Eggers' second film after The Witch, and although I had some problems with that film, it showed all the promise in the world. With The Lighthouse, we see a total manifestation of that promise. I haven't been so sure I was watching a modern classic in the making since 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. And even then, The Lighthouse beats that film by quite some distance. There's not a single aspect of this film that isn't handled with expertise and clever execution. The performances here by Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe are both the best of their respective career, and I have a hard time imagining something that could top them. Dafoe, seasoned as he is, has never been more equal parts terrifying and comedic. As for Pattinson, it is irrefutable that his Twilight days are far behind him. I make no exaggerations when I say moments of this film show the birth of this generation's Marlon Brando. Both characters carry the film on their shoulders as fleshed out, intriguing people who keep you guessing as their true intentions are constantly shifting, colored by the multifaceted dreamlike atmosphere. Fantastical elements are incorporated into the story, but they're left up to varying interpretations with equivalent plausibility. As reality itself betrays the characters, the film never uses vagueness as an excuse to slack on the complexity of their descent into drunken, violent madness. The story is still chock full of minimal but clever dialogue, well-blended humor, and masterful setup and payoff for every last story thread it spins. Even though the plot is not dialogue-driven, it features so many layers to unpack and evaluate. The sound design is visceral, intense, and realistic to a mind-boggling fault, with certain recurring sound effects associated with the film's increasing tension. This is the most intimidating rain I've ever heard in any movie. Just like in The Witch, Eggers uses natural lighting to horrific effect, but The Lighthouse takes that a step further with beautiful black and white cinematography and a 1:19:1 aspect ratio that invoke the vibe of classic horror. I don't say lightly that Eggers' cinematography here is so well done, so meticulously planned, we enter the realm of Stanley Kubrick's maniacal artisan ethos. Look, this is far and away the best film I've seen all year. Probably last year, too. As long as we're being real, this is a strong contender for best film of the decade. It's the kind of film that perfectly demonstrates the cinematic possibility of evoking raw sublimity. A movie other filmmakers will watch and say, "What are we even doing here?" The Lighthouse is impeccable in every way the best my critical skills can articulate, and I am giving it a 10 out of 10. Then I saw Terminator Dark Fate, and guess what? It was middling and mediocre. Between this movie's box office and audience reception, I think this film can stand as a pillar of how franchise recognition does not always equate to a safe profit. The first 5 minutes of this movie are incredibly stupid, but at least a good indication of the plot holes and unanswered questions that follow. Which is a shame, because for all the movie had to do, it actually starts out pretty promising. The scenes in Mexico actually had people speaking in Spanish with English subtitles. Most blockbusters would usually forego that option in favor of appealing to a mostly English-speaking audience. It's a small thing, but it went a long way in terms of authenticity. The action gets going pretty quick, and to my surprise, the first big action set piece was satisfying, and it actually felt worthy of a Terminator sequel. Linda Hamilton steps back into her character pretty well. I'd say Arnold does too, but he's been in all of these except Salvation, so it's not really stepping back in. The evil Terminator character was pretty fun. Not just for his 2 Terminators in one gimmick, but because he actually had some personality to him as he pretends to be human. But besides those things, not much else is all that great. The main problem with Dark Fate is it's just incredibly boring. The first action scene is great, but after that there's no action until the climax, and it's a pretty poorly paced ride there. The story is predictable and bland, with a ton of small choices that demonstrate a lack of creativity. The rationale behind Arnold's inclusion in the story is by far the franchise's worst. I guess the only thing I really hated was Mackenzie Davis's character. She's got a nice gimmick that keeps her vulnerable during the action scenes, but she's just an incredibly unlikable character. Imagine the individual worst moments of Brie Larson's tough chick posturing in Captain Marvel and just stretch that into an entire character. She makes Captain Marvel look like, well, Sarah Connor. I respect action heroes across gender, but even dudes have our John McClane and our Xander Cage. Grace is just one of the Xander Cages. It's not a complete train wreck, I guess, but on the whole, the good things don't make up for how many little decisions pull the story apart, and the annoyances that really start to pile up over time. I don't know what it is, but the first 2 Terminator movies have this ironclad canon the other films in the franchise can't seem to ruin, so it isn't like this movie matters anyway. Check it out if you want. I'm sure the producers would really appreciate it. And Terminator Dark Fate gets a 4 out of 10. We're almost done, guys. The next movie I saw was Jojo Rabbit, and I liked it. Taika Waititi is a pretty smart guy. It's pretty clear by now he knows filmmaking as a craft more than a lot of other directors, and that's really respectable. But from the trailers, you can see how eerily similar Jojo Rabbit emulates Wes Anderson, and especially Moonrise Kingdom. I don't think Waititi had any insidious motives behind it, but Anderson's style is so meticulous and non-replicable, other directors employing it inevitably don't do as good a job. Did he think we wouldn't notice or something? This is like Baz Luhrmann trying to do Black Swan. Regardless, Waititi's able to write and direct a film that's funny in ways a lot of comedies aren't. He certainly knows how to shoot and edit projects to make the jokes land, and the script is consistently funny. I remember I was chuckling fairly often. Most notably, the main character is a child actor with no prior film roles, and he still does a good job at both the drama and the comedy. The supporting cast is good, but they all kind of operate under the same joke. Sam Rockwell and Rebel Wilson are comically hateful idiots. Stephen Merchant looks like the sniper from TF2 and is a comically hateful idiot. Even though Taika himself as Hitler is much funnier than them, he's the same thing. He's a comically hateful idiot. And that's my biggest problem with the movie. If you keep up with the modern American political climate at all, it's pretty clear Waititi is not actually satirizing Nazis from World War II, but instead likening them to the hateful Republicans of today. The satire is so pointed and obvious as to what it represents, it comes across as though it's supposed to stroke the target audience's sense of superiority, rather than encourage reflection as satire is ultimately supposed to do. I hear the quote being passed around a lot that Jojo Rabbit is a satire of hate, but presents such an unchallenging, rigid dichotomy of what real-world people it considers hateful and who it does not. This self-congratulatory moral perception doesn't ruin the film for me, but it might very well for others. Jojo Rabbit, in the end, was a good film. Even if it's pretty up its own ass in terms of satire, I still recommend it because it's an enjoyable comedy made by a guy who clearly knows his stuff. And I'm giving it a 6 out of 10. I also saw Midway, and it was pretty This is the definition of a dad movie. A movie you watch with your dad and just have a grand old dad time. I generally like films that draw attention to battles people unfamiliar with the general progression of World War II might not know about, and that's certainly true here. The trouble can sometimes be the filmmakers count on the weight of the true story to compensate for cutting corners in the filmmaking. I'm an American with what I like to think is a healthy level of patriotism. I don't mind some rah-rah Americana in my war films, but I need something, else. In typical Roland Emmerich fashion, everybody barely has any characterization. Characters and performances aren't automatically good because of my respect for the military. There are military movies that actually work hard to be good movies that are furthered by that respect, whereas the direction in this film is noticeably sloppy. The way this film introduces and reintroduces certain plot threads is so haphazard. Aaron Eckhart just disappears midway through the film. So many scenes fall flat when they're obviously meant to have some kind of weight to them, and there's some pacing issues I really don't get towards the climax. Now, to the film's credit, the dogfight action was pretty good despite being noticeably fake. One thing I like that's not in a ton of other war films is that there are moments of genuine human error. Not everything in the film goes perfectly, and sometimes people die just because they kind of fucked up. There's just not much else to report. They can't all be Hacksaw Ridge and Saving Private Ryan. Heck, as far as Roland Emmerich goes, they can't even all be The Patriot. Check this out if you want, but I was pretty uninvested the whole way through. Maybe see it with your dad. I'm giving it a 5 out of 10. I then saw Parasite, and I think it was fantastic. This is now the highest rated narrative film on Letterboxd. I don't know if I'd go that far, but this is still a pretty exceptional and special movie. Even if you are not the kind of person who enjoys foreign films, I strongly encourage you to check it out anyway. I'd say this is one of the most accessible foreign films I've ever seen. Many of the film's strengths are easy to understand, but that isn't to say they're lacking in complexity. The film has an amazing screenplay, incredibly well paced with some of the best editing you'll see all year. The cinematography is extremely gentle and calculated and purposeful, and as far as films with social commentary go, Parasite executes it about as perfect as a film possibly could. For some reason, the best films of the year all seem to succeed balancing comedy within their more serious tone. I certainly welcome this trend, and Parasite does it very well too. The first act especially is full of the protagonists making darkly comic actions that drove the plot forward. Maybe it's just my sense of humor, but this was by far the funniest part of the film for me. Throughout the film, I was reminded of The Favorite, and how that film maintained the moral fluidity of its characters, ultimately leaving it up to you whether or not you would root for them. Neither film makes it an easy decision or tells you what the right answer is either, but I think Parasite handles this a little better. The only thing I'd say brought the film down at all was an over-reliance on violin crescendos during moments that were supposed to be tense. I don't know, seems like the mood of each scene was communicated so effectively everywhere else it didn't seem necessary. Anyway, check out Parasite as soon as you can. It is a wonderful, unique movie, and I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. Next is Frozen 2, and despite my initial reaction being overwhelmingly positive, I have incredibly mixed feelings about it. I'm pretty sure I'm one of the few people left who genuinely loves the first Frozen. At least among film buffs, I certainly am. The biggest downgrade in Frozen 2 compared to the original is its script. A lot of these recent Disney sequels haven't felt planned. I don't know if that's the case here, but while I think the story itself does a way better job justifying its existence, there are parts of the execution that are just straight up bad. The second act of this film is a bit of a mess. There's a solid 20 minutes worth of filler, and most of the new characters are entirely wasted, despite their importance clearly being implied in the trailer. It's pretty obvious Disney had no idea where to take some of these old characters. Olaf has nothing to do and is way less funny than in the first movie. Kristoff has a really cliche and cringy story arc in this. Both of these characters are, for some reason, given song sequences that come out of nowhere and stink. There are parts of the film's story that are way more predictable than the first. If you're one of those people who thought Hans being the villain was obvious, you'll feel downright insulted watching this. But yeah, those were a bulk of my problems with the movie. While the second act meanders a lot, that's the only part of the movie that's really like that. The first and third acts are much more streamlined. Despite the examples I gave before, the music is still really good. Even if the writers had no idea what to do with one of the old characters, they're still incredibly likable. Somehow, among all of this, the film still works in a message about colonialism. We get to see more creative uses of Elsa's powers. I'm not joking when I say certain sequences in this are among the best imagery Disney has ever put out. Perhaps I'm a little biased since Elsa is my favorite Disney princess, but the movie becomes unquestionably better when it focuses on her. When the writers really get down to it, they can pull off fantastic character moments and visuals, and those things elevate the film incredibly, but those moments are less frequent than I like, especially compared to the first film. I find both movies in this franchise incredibly interesting to talk about. Despite the fluffy reputation they have, I think they're rather intricate. Maybe I'll make another video elaborating on that someday, but for now I'm giving Frozen 2 an 8 out of 10. It probably deserves a 7, but in my heart it's an 8. Die mad about it.
Finally, I saw Knives Out, and it was pretty fun. I admit part of that charm comes from Rian Johnson being the most hated director in Hollywood as far as audiences are concerned. With such a large base of people dedicated to microscopically nitpicking your writing and your films, do you know how big of a power move it is to make your next movie an homage to old mystery films, considering that genre is inherently cheesy? Anyways, Knives Out was still incredibly enjoyable. This film has an exceptional cast. The characters are all well suited to the actors playing them, even Daniel Craig with his majestic Foghorn Leghorn impersonation. They're all used to their full potential. The film is full of clashing personalities and motivations. It's all very entertaining to watch. Now, the film sets itself up as a deliberate throwback to old whodunit murder mysteries, and both the cinematography and especially the score work to establish this cheeky tone right from the beginning. Nowadays, a movie like that runs the risk of seeming incredibly cheesy, but that never really becomes a problem here. The old school murder mystery elements and dialogue that could have come across that way didn't bother me for the most part. But with so many character moments, there are bound to be some that just don't work. The line, CSI KFC, is just as bad as it was in the trailer. There's also some really bad attempts at modernizing parts of the story. The younger characters are walking punchlines about cell phones and jewels. Entire scenes are dedicated to extremely out-of-place political banter that's overall unnecessary, besides being pure cringe. The film's mystery ain't that hard to figure out, which is kinda disappointing, but I can't pretend like I don't know why that is. Producers probably don't think a postmodern audience will be satisfied by just setting up a group of characters and finding out which one is guilty. To circumvent this, Rian Johnson frames the story around pieces of dramatic irony that aren't bad in of themselves, but create a story that clashes with the homage tone he's going for. It feels like he was trying to simultaneously modernize and throw back to the whodunit, which doesn't make sense. I generally like Rian Johnson, but even I can admit he sometimes overextends his grasp on dialectic tension and will throw things together that don't belong. This never ruins the story or the characters, but because of it, the story feels a little more uneven than I think he wanted it to. The mystery that ultimately gets us to the end is still fun to watch unfold and piece together. Not everything works, but I was consistently entertained and having a fun time. And I think Knives Out deserves a 6 out of 10. And I guess a new Avengers movie came out or something. It was pretty good. It gets worse the more I think about it, though. 7 out of 10. Will probably be a 6 eventually, but what can you do?